Okay, welcome to our Erev Shabbat Parashat class, Perashat Bo, the culmination of the Esed Makot, the Exodus from Egypt, the exciting, thrilling, dramatic episodes that are recorded in its parasha. Do we see the most historic pasuk in the entire Torah? Maybe. You know, Yetziat Mitzrayim serves so many functions. First of all, and obviously, it keeps the promise that Kadosh Baruch Hu made to the Avot, to our forefathers, and the Bri Ben HaBetarim, and the ensuing other promises. And Kadosh Baruch Hu is reliable and sticks to his word. Of course, it's a demonstration of justice, where he metes out retribution to the evil, as he said to Abraham that he would do in the Bri Ben HaBetarim, and he justly and righteously frees a slave nation. It is, of course, a demonstration, a year-long demonstration, an educational process to the nations at large, to Mitzrayim, the nations of the world, and also to Am Yisrael in terms of the existence and the abilities of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the essence, to the best of our abilities to try to understand that essence. But beyond everything else, Yetziat Mitzrayim is, and the events of this parasha are an absolute confirmation of the will of God and the objective of the creation and God's perpetuation of the existence of us, mankind and us, on the face of this earth. And that's a bold statement. But if I take it to one single pasuk, and that's the only thing we're going to focus on in this class, is a single verse in the parasha, I'll show you what I mean. So it's a very important pasuk. It is Parashat Bo. It's in Perek Yud Bet. It's after the entire speech that we read. Of course, we read this also on Parashat HaChodesh, and then the details of Korban Pesach afterwards, and then the actual event of Makat Bechorot, Bahasi Halayla, and then Am Yisrael starts to leave, Misharotam, Sidro Besumlotam, and they go from Ramesses to Sukkot, and they're out. Erev Rav goes with them. They have the Masot because they couldn't wait. They didn't bring Sedah, enough food for the road. And then it says, and this is what I gave my parasha class on last year, Moshav B'nai Israel, the interesting and can say somewhat controversial pasuk, the 430-year stay in Mitzrayim, and that brings us to pasuk Mem Bet. So let me read Mem Aleph as the build-up. Vahi mechesh roshim shana v'arba meot shana, vahi be'esem hayom hazeh yaseu kol sebot Adonai meretz Mitzrayim. And it was, after 430 years, that very day, all the hosts of God, the legions of God, the army of God, meaning the nation of God, left Eretz Mitzrayim after that 210-year stay and this 430-year period. Pasuk Mem Bet. Leil Shemurim Hu Ladunai Lehosiam Me'eretz Mitzrayim. Hu Halayla Hazeh Ladunai Shemurim Lechol B'nai Yisrael Dorotam. You can pretty easily look at this pasuk to have a few commas inside, although there's one atnach, which is sort of serving as a period. But you can read the pasuk in three segments. Leil Shemurim Hu, this is a night that is literally, Lishmor means to guard. Shemurim means a night that has been guarded. But it is a night that has been waited for, has been anticipated. A night that was in the making, so to speak, for God, L'hosiam, to take them out of Mitzrayim. Segment 2, Hu Halayla Hazel Adonai, this is the night for God, In segment 3, we see that word again, shimurim lechol b'nei Yisrael dorotam. It is guarded, anticipated, or something like that, but now in the future tense, for all b'nei Yisrael, for generations, for the future. So, the participants that are with us here actually just broke that up in an easier way on this sheet, and everyone else who's listening live to the recording can follow in the pasuk and try to see what I mean in terms of this breakup. So if you look again at that pasuk, you'll see that there's not only 3 segments to that pasuk, but the segments are divided into time frames. In other words, the first third of the pasuk, again, is called Leil Shimurim, the guarded night, or the anticipated night, the night in the making for a God to take them out of Mitzrayim. That's what is, you can say, Be'avad, referring to the past. And you can, what I call the original statement. In other words, that's the original intent for that night. Incidentally, the night we're talking about is the first night of Pesach, the night of the 15th day of Nisan, smack in the middle of the month of Nisan. The second segment of the pasuk, Hu halayla hazeh l'Adonai. It is this night for God, and I call that Hoveh, the current or the constant. In other words, that segment is describing how this night, the 15th of Nisan, the Exodus, the night of Yetziat Mitzrayim, became the night of God, as we'll see, throughout the ages, from that point and on, and still is the night of God, so to speak. So it was the original night of God, Leil Shimurim. He guarded and anticipated that night. It is then became transformed to be the constant night of God, Hu halayla hazeh, the definite article. It is this night of God. And then seems to be futuristic, Atid. Shimurim, it is a guarded night, Ledorotam, the Bnei Israel, for generations, meaning for the future. So with our simple knowledge of Hebrew grammar, we can divide the 3 segments into this night into Avad, Hoveh, and Atid, past, present, and future. Or as I call it, original, constant, and futuristic. So I asked rhetorically, because I believe it's true, is this the most historic pasuk in the Torah? And I'll tell you why I think it is, and why the statement I made about Yetziat Mitzrayim and the magnitude of that night is true. So let's look at each one of these segments. Leil Shimurim Hu Ladonai. What does that mean? It's like, right? We know we call on Leil Pesach several times. We refer to the night as Leil Shimurim. It's a night of protection for us. We relate to that, right? But Shimurim really is vis-a-vis Hashem. Hashem, not necessarily protecting, but guarding, holding. He created a night, or he marked a day or a night on his calendar that he's looking forward to. So what does that mean? It's a famous Gemara, Masechet Rosh Hashanah. Rabbi Yeshua says as follows. The pasuk tells us, Leil Shimurim, Laila hamishumar uba misheshet yemei bereshit. There are a few different versions of this in the Midrash, but in the Gemara it says that it's a night, the 15th night of Nisan, the night of the Exodus, that is mishumar uba, meaning that it's a night that was created, reserved, mishumar uba, and continued to be that reserved night from when? Sheshet Yemei Bereshit, from creation. Now, what does that mean? The 15th of Nisan was reserved from creation. That sort of sounds like that Am Yisrael already had a night of Exodus, Yetziat Mitzrayim, from creation, from B'riyat HaOlam. That's problematic from a philosophical standpoint, because we know that Am Yisrael were not chosen against our will, or we're not, there's no predestined nation prior to the creation of the world. We believe in free choice. And we believe that mankind in general, when created, had the opportunity to become the chosen people of God. All of God's people could have been the chosen people of God, the entire human race. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu had patience as he waited for centuries and millennia for mankind to do what was expected of them. In a very basic way, they failed him. And we know Avraham Avinu came along and the rest is history. And we, therefore, starting with our forefathers, earned the distinction of being a chosen nation. And then, as the plan of God rolled out, eventually that official choice was began to be developed on the night of the 15th of Nisan. And that's our night of redemption. It's a night of Geulah. And that's where our official chosenness begins. So what does this mean? From creation, this night was reserved. It's very simple. It means that Kadosh Baruch Hu anticipated that some people, it could have been many peoples, heck, it could have been all the peoples, but there has to be some point in time in history where mankind is demonstrating that they understand and conceive of the objective of existence. They are performing God's will. God is satisfied by that, so to speak. And because of that, God then rewards. And rewarding is putting a people that have got to that level on track to fulfill the rest of the objective of existence of mankind, which is having a relationship with God, recognizing the single, all-powerful, primal, omniscient creator, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and eventually ushering in a further time of full redemption, messianic time, and then come the major rewards to Hayat HaMetim, Olam Haba, etc. That's the big picture. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so to speak, marked that on his calendar. Whoever it would be, whatever peoples would get the point and then earn that distinction to be chosen with the starting point of redemption, because you see, Am Yisrael is only the beginning of redemption. We're still being redeemed. We're still in that process until the full redemption. But that night kicks off redemption. That was marked on God's calendar. That was Shimurim. That was reserved. That was anticipated by God from creation. In other words, God created the world with a purpose, with an objective, and that would begin to be realized on that night. Who would take it? Someone would take it. It was us. Baruch Hashem. It was us. But that, the first segment of this pasuk, demonstrates that this was a historic night that was already in the making from creation, because it represented the objective of creation. And we simply were the ones that took the prize and carried the baton. And now it's time for that night to come to fruition. So let's read that first segment again. Leil Shimurim Hu Ladonai Losiam Eres Mitzrayim. That's it. That's the night in the making. That's the reserved, anticipated night to take them out. Who's them? A chosen nation out of Eres Mitzrayim, and it could have been anywhere, but to redeem them, to extract them from somewhere else, and to I give them a distinction and an identity and an independence to be chosen and recognized by God as fulfilling. We're beginning to fulfill Hashem's purpose of creation and existence. That's all the first segment. That's the avar. That's the, so to speak, past. That's the past history of this night. Segment 2. Hu halayla hazer latunai. This is who halayla. It's identified halayla, the night. This night for God. And I said that represents the constant nature of this night. There is an unbelievable, powerful midrash in Esther Rabbah, meaning on Megillat Esther, the Midrash Rabbah on Megillat Esther. That identifies a number of times in Tanakh where a night is identified by the definite article, either halayla, balayla, layla hahu, that night, the night, the already recognized nights. And when it says that in a certain dramatic type of event in Tanakh, that the Midrash points out and identifies being this same night, the night of the 15th of Nisan. And here's the examples. Well, first it's our Perashat, Yetziat Mitzrayim. It's called Vahi Bahasi HaLayla, in the middle of that night. In the book of Shofetim, when Gideon was chosen by God as the Shofet, as the leader, and he had these impending incredible battles that were building up, and the enemies that were anticipating great victory and annihilation of the Jewish people included Amalek and Midian. And of course, Gideon was awarded an incredible victory, a sure wipeout, slam dunk, no question victory. And there it said, and the night of that war, leading up to that war, Vahi balayla hahu, on that night. That night, that was the night. That was the night of redemption that Am Yisrael had already seen a salvation and redemption. That's the night that Gideon and his armies were successful. Later on, in the book of Melachim, and during the time of the first Beit HaMikdash, and the great king Hizkiyahu was surrounded by Ashur and the army led by Sanherib, the Sarsava, an evil man, and it was a siege. We were going down. That was a nice amount of time before the first Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. We were going down. But there was no chance. Logistically, there was no chance. We were so outnumbered. We were so weakened. We were so overpowered. And they were licking their chops. They were ready for full annihilation. And it says, Vahi balayla hahu vayeseh malach Hashem. That night, an angel of God came out. This is not in the Midrash, this is in the Pesukim. And he killed the army. No less than 180,000 soldiers died. Poof, that night. Balayla hahu, and the Midrash tells us there's no coincidence over here. It's the night of redemption, the night of the 15th of Nisan. And then, much later in history, after the Churban, the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, we're already in exile. And we are, after the Babylonians took over, and then the Persians took over, and now a famous story in Megillat Esther, and with the decree of Haman to annihilate the Jewish people. And then Haman was ready to hang Mordechai, and that was going to be it. That was going to seal our fate, God forbid, complete destruction. And of course, we know what happened. On that night, the king couldn't sleep, and the rest is history. The tide was turned. That night, Hachamim tell us, the night of Pesach, 15th of Nisan. So again, let's read that second segment. Hu halayla hazeh ladonai. That became the night of God. Once that night was reserved for redemption, and redemption was activated in that first time of Yetziat Mitzrayim, that became the night of redemption. That became the night that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had already carved out. It wasn't the past moment in history. It was already an energized time period, so to speak, where HaKadosh Baruch Hu had set aside for constant salvation of Am Yisrael. And over the ages, over the centuries, over and over again, we saw how he exercised that night, indeed, as a night of redemption. That is the hoveh, the present tense, the constant nature of this incredibly historic night. And then finally, the third segment, Shimurim L'chol B'nai Yisrael Dorotam. It is reserved, this night is for all times, for future generations for Am Yisrael. It's a famous machloket, Masechet Rosh Hashanah and the Gemara. Rabbi Yeshua's opinion is, and it's the accepted opinion, B'Nisan Nichalu U'B'Nisan Atidim Hegaya. The month of Nisan was not only the past month of redemption, but it is B'Ezrat Hashem, the future month of redemption. And that night, that reserved night, is our future redemption. Now, there are ideas that Hachamim speak of, that the Mashiach in the future will come perhaps after the holiday of Pesach. But this night, in terms of this idea conveyed in the Gemara, continues to be the night, the reserved night for full redemption. Yetziat Mitzrayim was the beginning of redemption. It's a historic march that our forefathers took part in, but we are still on that march. That march hasn't ended because Mashiach hasn't come. We haven't seen full redemption. And so therefore that night continues. It continues to take on a life of its own. Historically, before we were ready for full Geulah, it was still a night of salvation throughout the course of time, but it remains in its status. It hasn't been shaken. It still is and will continue to be until we see the final Geulah Shilema, the night of redemption. Leil Shimurim, it's guarded, and it is anticipated to be the night that wraps it all up. And so what we have in our parasha is a night that, in a pasuk that describes a night, a day, that is the day that marks the reason, no less than the creation of the world and the universe. And a night that we eventually are so fortunate to have the forefathers and the mercy of God that gave us the opportunity to be the ones that took advantage of that night. And then we ride the wave, this constant night of salvation throughout history until the anticipated night of full redemption comes. And we see, therefore, possibly the most historic pasuk in the entire Torah in our parasha. Shabbat Shalom.